lecture. So, we were discussing visual elements and graphics. And the last thing that we talked on the last lecture was fav icon or favorites icon, how to set that thing on your page. So the next thing that we are going to discuss is CSS sprites. So it's a modern technique to optimize the use of multiple icon or small images. So a sprite is an image file that contains multiple small graphics that are configured as background image for various web page elements. So the benefit of sprites is it saves overhead by reducing the number of HTTP requests made by the browser. That means there is like a bunch of small graphics which you load together and then show you based on your need. When we will actually discuss more about CSS sprites and show examples in one of our later lectures. But for now, just remember that CSS sprites is a technique, optimization technique, when you are going to use like multiple small images. So instead of loading multiple images, you create one image file and then use techniques to show different parts of that image file which will resemble different images. Okay. So let's move to the next thing. So sources for graphics. Where does these graphics come from? The graphics that you use on your web page. Well, there are different sources. One is you can create them yourself, right? There are different tools and softwares to create graphics elements which you can use, or you can download from the free sites. So if you're downloading a graphics that you want to reuse, you have to be very careful about the copyright claims. So that's why I'm saying like download from free sites. Or if you want to use a copyrighted thing, in that case you have to purchase the graphics, right? Or you can use your own photographs, scan photographs, or scan your drawings, or hire someone who will create graphics for you. And then there are some guidelines for using images. First of all, try to reuse images. The reason is if you reuse images, then basically you are loading the image once and then using it. It will actually save bandwidth for you. And then consider the size versus quality issue, right? So the thing is, if you want to use very high quality images, in that case the size will increase a lot, and vice versa, right? If you reduce the size, the quality will decrease. So you have to find a middle ground, uh, depending on what kind of website you are building. So you have to do a trade-off between size and the image quality. Then consider image load time. Be careful when using images on web pages. It takes time for them to load. Optimize the file size and dimensions of images for efficient web page display. Okay. Then use appropriate resolution. Uh, So this thing is important because depending on what kind of monitors or what kind of screen uh, the user is using, depending on that, your image may like get the quality may or the quality may have like the quality may change a lot. So you have to be very careful about those aspects when you are actually choosing your image. So be careful of the resolution and use appropriate resolution. Then specify dimensions, use accurate height and width attributes on image tags. That's important. This will allow the browser to allocate the appropriate space on the web page for the image and load the page faster. And finally, be aware of brightness and contrast. This is because the images that you saw on MacBooks or in Windows operating system, they have different default settings, which actually make the images look different. So when you are, or depending on the phone also, like depending what phone you are using, Android or iOS. So when you are actually creating a web page, you have to keep this in mind, making sure that your page looks fine in all kind of devices running different operating systems. Okay, so finally, the accessibility, which we were discussing at the beginning when we started when we started discussing this chapter at the beginning. We talked a little bit about accessibility. So first of all, these are the recommendations when you ensure accessibility for everyone. First of all, don't rely on color alone, because suppose you have put something like your section, either some of your section or some of the images, uh, if the colors actually mean very specific things. Suppose you write your page may have some section which is colored in green, and then another section that is colored in red, uh, and by green actually you mean something positive or do's, and by red you mean don'ts. So you are basically relying on the color for the user to understand the concept of what you are trying to uh, relay, right, or portray. But if you are doing something like this, you have to be very careful, because some visitors may have color perception deficiencies, some may be colorblind. Uh, so the your the reason or uh, the reason you are using the color itself might not serve those people, right? So that's the thing, like don't rely just on color alone to convey some message, and make sure that there is high contrast between background and text color. Otherwise, it might be very difficult for some people to read the text. And the second recommendation is provide a text equivalent for non-text elements. Uh, One of the ways to do that is using the alt attribute on your image elements. And the final thing is, if your site navigation uses image links, provide simple text links at the bottom of the page. I think I have already showed you one example where image links are being used. So at the bottom, there are like regular links also added in case the images don't load. Okay, so just go through these checkpoints to do a self-evaluation, that make sure that you have actually learned the concepts. If you don't have the answers to this, go back, uh, read the contents and watch the video again, making sure that your concept is clear now. So the next thing that we are going to talk about, uh, the next things that we are going to talk about is introducing new CSS properties that provide visual effect on web pages, including like rounded corners, um, box shadows, text shadows, opacity, transparent colors with RGBA, transparent color with HSLA, and gradients. So basically, in these slides, we are going to discuss about different CSS properties that for providing visual effect on web pages. Okay. So first of all, rounded corners. So you can see, so the CSS property that creates rounded corners for the border is border radius. So if the border radius property has the same one single value, that single value would get applied to all four corners of the border. Also, you can, instead of putting one value, you can put like four values. In that case, it will actually show you like clockwise. So this is top left, and then top right, and then bottom right, and finally the bottom left. Okay. So if you define a style for an element, suppose this one might be, I guess this is a heading element. So a style is defined for heading, where CSS border radius property is used, and it has four values. You see the highest radius is 100, and you see the reflection here, right? And the lowest is 5. It's almost rectangular here. Okay, so the next thing is CSS. The next CSS property that we are going to talk about is a box shadow property. Okay. So what the box shadow property does is it configures the horizontal offset, vertical offset, blur radius, and valid color values. Here is one example of a box shadow property, which has like four values. You can see four values here. So the thing that you're seeing here, you are defining a style rule. You're actually defining an ID rule, right? Because it starts with hash. Then it has four values, 5, 5, 5, and then it's a code, RGB code for a color. So what it means is it configures a dark gray drop shadow with 5 pixel horizontal offset, 5 pixel vertical offset, and 5 pixel blur radius. So what the horizontal offset is, this value configures the shadow on the right, and if it's negative, then it configures the shadow on the left. So this is horizontal offset. Then the vertical offset, so this one configures a shadow in the a shadow below, but if the second value is negative, then it configures a shadow above. The third one is blur radius. It configures a numeric pixel value. If omitted, it defaults to the value 0, which configures a sharp shadow. Higher values configure more blur. And finally, the color value. It configures a valid color value for the shadow. Okay, so let's see if we have one example for this. Okay. Okay, so let's see this. Okay, first the rounded corner. So let's look at this one. See the style rule here, and this rule is defined for a heading element, and then the border radius is set to 15. It means that if I have an heading element, then it will have like rounded corners. The radius is 15. So if I increase it to say 50, see, it will be more round now. You see? Okay. So the next CSS property we're going to look at is shadow. Okay, so here you see that inside the body we have a header element, and inside that we have a heading element. Now if we go to the style rules, the embedded style rules, there is one style rule defined for the heading element. You see it here. And then the box shadow. Is there like, no, there is text shadow here. Let's see. Okay, so this one has this box shadow property. Okay, so there is an ID rule defined, and the name is container. So the box shadow is defined like this: 5, 5, 5. Next, this style rule uh, is applied on this div element. So if you look very carefully, notice this, you will see everything inside the body is in this div element, and the div element uses the ID attribute. That means it uses the CSS design that is defined here. Okay. Now one of those is like box shadow. So it creates shadow on the left, bottom. Okay. So let's change some of these values. And also the color of the shadow is kind of blackish. So let's make changes here. I should instead do this. So let's make it 25 and see how things change. So look at these shadows, right? You're looking at these shadows. If I change it 25, now you see the shadow on the right. Actually, we have like a big shadow on the right. If I make it, suppose, let's say minus 25, then the shadow should move to the left, right? You see, the shadow is now has moved to the left. So this is the horizontal offset. Now the next one is, the next value is for the vertical offset, 5 pixel, and because of that you see the shadow here in the bottom. If it was like a negative one, you would have seen the shadow on the top. And then the third one is the blur radius. So by the blur radius, we configure the sharpness of the shadow. So let's make it the third value, let's make it 25. Now you see the shadow now got more blurred, right? Did you notice that? So this is the blur radius. And the final thing is the color of the shadow. So let's make it 15. Less blur. And let's change the color of the shadow. Let's make it 5. Now you see it's a kind of reddish shadow, right? And I made it less blurred. Okay, so now you understand the shadow property, box shadow property, right? This CSS property. Let's go back to our slide. There is an optional keyword called inset. I think so far the shadows that you saw is created outside. So I'm hoping that if I put inset, then the shadow should be created inside. Say inset. Yeah, now do you see the shadow is being created inside the element, inside the div element. Let's make it more blur, make it 50. Yeah, now it's more blurred, but all the shadows are created inside. So this is the optional keyword, and if you mention this one, then the shadow would be created inside instead of outside. Okay, next is the CSS opacity property. As the name suggests, it configures the opacity of the element. Opacity range is between 0 and 1. 0 means completely transparent and 1 means completely opaque. Here is one example. You have a background color and then you set the opacity of the background color of the background, and you see it's kind of transparent, right? Let me show you one example. Okay, so Control Shift I. Let's see. You see, this looks kind of transparent. You can see the trees and leaves behind this. So if we look inside the body, we have one div element. And then inside the div element, we have this heading 1 element. Now let's look at this one. So the rule for the heading 1 element is you set the background color to white. This is the code for white, right? And you change the opacity to 0.6. So the background of this heading 1 is white, but it's a bit transparent. So let's change it. Let's change the opacity to 0.2. Oh, now you see it has become like almost transparent. It's almost gone. Let's change it to 0.9. So it will be less transparent now. You see? Okay, so we can change the transparency of the background using this uh, opacity CSS rule. So this is the rule, opacity. So 0 means completely transparent and 1 means completely opaque. Okay. Okay, so next RGBA color. What is CSS RGBA color property? Well, I think already you have guessed that RGB, R is for red, G is for green, B is for blue. Now, CSS supports a new syntax for color property that configures a transparent color called RGBA color. So it's actually a function. So the first value is for red, green, blue, and the last value is for transparent. Like you define define a value between 0, which is transparent, and 1, opaque. Okay, so here in this example, you see this style rule defined for a heading element. The color has been set to, this is white. So this is the, just the color means what? It means text color, right? So define it white, and then you define the opacity. So basically, you see this is transparent, this is writing itself. So inside the div we have one h1 element, and the rule for the h1 element is defined here. So you see this color, this is a color means font color, right? Or the front color, not the background color. The foreground color is 255, 255, 255, which is white. And then the transparency is defined to 0.7, so it looks a little bit transparent, right? I can increase the transparency. Let's make it let's make it 0.3 to be more transparent now. See, almost gone, right? Or let's make it, if you make it 1, then it will be totally white. Let's make it 0.9. Now it's almost opaque. It's almost opaque. Okay, so RGB color is adding opacity on top of color. And the way you define it is you use the CSS property color, and then as the value, you use RGBA parenthesis, and it takes 4 parameters. The first 3 are for red, green, and blue, and the last one is for the opacity. Next is HSLA color. So this is also like RGBA, but the four parameters here are H for hue, S for saturation, L for lightness, and finally optional is alpha. So hue, saturation, light, and alpha. The reason we may need okay, so the HSLA is helpful because for many years, web designers have configured RGB color using either hexadecimal or decimal values on web pages. Now, one thing is RGB color is based on hardware. The red, the green, the blue light that is emitted from computer monitors. CSS introduces a new color notation system called HSLA based on a color wheel model which stands for hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha. And HSLA is supported by the most recent versions of all major browsers. So here is some example of HSLA. So basically you define the colors based on their hue, saturation, light, and alpha value. So if you want to understand a little bit more about HSLA, please visit your textbook and read the details there. Okay, so the next final thing that we are going to talk about is CSS gradient property. Gradients property. So CSS provides a method to configure color as a gradient, which is a smooth blending of shades from one color to another. So a CSS gradient background color is defined purely with CSS. No image file is needed. These provide flexibility for web designers along with a savings in the bandwidth required to serve out gradient background image files. Okay, let me show you one example. So if you remember, uh, when we actually showed the background image thing, what was that? Where was that example? Okay, I think I had showed you one example here. So if you remember, there was, okay, let me show you this. So you see there was some gradient color. You can see some gradient here. At the beginning of the top, there was green, and then green got lighter, and it became almost whitish in the bottom, right? So this is for the whole page. The technique that was used is using this image. So you see this image, it has green on the top, and then the green becomes lighter and becomes almost white in the bottom. So this image was actually tiled or repeated again and again to create something like this, a background color. Now the problem here is you have to use an image and then tile it, right? Instead, CSS provides you a way that where you can actually do the same kind of thing using the gradient property. So let me show you one example. So here you see in the bottom we have some like sky blue color, and on the top we have white, right? But in this case we are not using any image for to creating this kind of gradient background. Instead what we are doing is, let's see, so you see we have one div element and then we have the body. Now there is a rule for the body. You see, do you see that? There is a rule for that. And then in the background image, instead of using any image, we are using this gradient function, which is provided by CSS. So it says linear gradient, and then it has two values. The first value is white, and the second value is a bluish color. So this means from the top to the bottom, from white it will gradually change to blue. Okay, so this is we are using the linear gradient function here, the CSS function. The other way to do it is, okay, so what it makes sure is on the top you have white, and then on the bottom you have blue, and gradually white changes into blue. Okay, now if you go to the example here, not this one. So if you go to the example here you see this is the background image, right? This was the same example that I showed you, and we showed you the linear gradient, right? Either you can put the linear gradient directly, or you can put like linear in the function. Okay, so there are two kind of things. One is linear gradient, and the other one is radial gradient. So here in this example, you saw linear gradient, right? So the difference between them is linear gradient is a smooth blending of color in a single direction, such as from top to bottom or from bottom to the right. Okay. Whereas the radial gradient is a smooth blending of color eliminating outwards from a single point. So if I change it to, let's try to change it to radial gradient. So basically there is some gradient. It's actually, can we do this for the, let's see, for the div element? Container. So div element follows this container rule. So let's try to bring this inside the div element. Okay. Yeah, now it makes sense. So can you see this? So for the div element, I added a background image and use this radial gradient function, right? I use this radial gradient function where the first value is white and the second value is black. So from white, you see there is a white in the middle and then black on the edges. Okay. Now if I make it, suppose if I change it to linear gradient, let's see what happens. So this is a rule for the container ID, right? Let's make it linear gradient. Now you see on the top it's white and then in the bottom is black. Okay. Okay. Okay, so finally to summarize, we talked about the visual elements and graphics on web pages. As you continue to create web pages, try to look back and at the guidelines and accessibility issues related to graphics. And one of the major issues or major things that the users consider around the world about accessing web page is how long the web page actually takes to load or something. So once you're using images and graphics, you have to be very careful and optimize the user experience. And finally, using the alternative to images, I think this final example was how to use an alternative to images using CSS, right? So with that, we finish this chapter.